This is Enneagram Invitations, saying yes to transformation. I'm Karen Burley, a multi-certified Enneagram teacher, somatic facilitator, and transformationalist. Join me and other seasoned Enneagram students as we explore how the Enneagram invites us to wake up and transform, personally and collectively. We are delving into the highs, lows, and everything in between on the journey inward. Leave feeling inspired to recognize the invitations you're receiving, and, when the time is right, the courage to say yes. Here we go. Today on the podcast, we have an interview between two social nines. You're in store for a treat as I explore nineness and an invitation to loving presence with Seth Abram. Seth self-describes as human, husband, father, musician, and learner. Originally Ohio-bred, he has spent the last 14 years in Nashville with his wife Sarah, raising their 4 kids. He is an Enneagram certified professional, co-host of Fathoms, an Enneagram podcast, and content creator for the Instagram account at Integrated Enneagram. Seth spent 20 years in the music industry, 5 years as a pastor, and at 40, he is pursuing his bachelor's degree in psychology while also training for a triathlon. In his spare time, he loves reading about the worlds of psychology and spirituality. And Seth is deeply committed to personal and collective change, healing, and transformation. He is also a coach, helping others grow awareness, cultivate deeper emotional capacity, move toward greater wholeness, and live more fully. So you're going to hear all of that in this interview. This was the first time that Seth and I got to quote unquote meet in real time, face to face, having an exchange. And I honestly think partly because I had seen Seth as such a role model for me as a 9, I had a lot come up for me being on the Zoom call with him before we hit record. So you'll hear us kind of talking about that in this episode. It was a really interesting experience to have, and Seth held it so well. You're going to get some raw stuff here. In the time since this recording, I got to meet Seth at an International Enneagram Association conference, and he and his friends and co-hosts over at Fathoms had me on their show to share about my experience as a 9. They put together a really wonderful episode with a bunch of different Enneagram teachers, and then there's an interview with me about how I hold my 9ness. So if you can't get enough about 9s, be sure to check that out over on the Fathoms podcast. Okay, without further delay, here we go into my conversation with Seth. Well, here we are. We have just had quite a pre-podcast experience together, so I feel like we know each other a bit more now.
Yeah, we just recorded. Well, we didn't record, but we already did a podcast, basically. Yes. That
I
was
would call
amazing.
it more of a healing session or something.
Yeah. I feel that. Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's so good to be able to invite you on into this space where we can just keep exploring and wading into the depths of whatever shows up in the present moment.
Mm,
This podcast is really about how we say yes to the invitations that are presented to us through the lens of the Enneagram, but
mm,
certainly it feels like on a much deeper level, just through presence is how I hold it.
mm,
And I'm just so excited to hear more from you about this process of like saying yes
mm.
to transformational work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just want to say I'm very grateful to be here. I'm honored that you invited me to this space. So thanks for having me. And just in the moment when you said that word yes, I recalled last year I spent a couple days at a monastery in Kentucky. Are you familiar with Thomas Merton?
A little bit.
Yeah, it's where he spent his whole monastic career, if you will. And yeah, I just remember one of the meditations that I did on one of the days was a walking meditation. And I just slowed down my pace as low as I possibly could. And with every step, what I did was I felt the sensation of each part of my foot hit the ground, and I took about 2 hours to walk what would normally be probably 5 minutes. And with every step, I said yes to the life that is here. And it was one of the more, I don't know, just amazing experiences to witness everything, to truly see things in a way that I hadn't before. Something I do with my kids from time to time is I ask them if they want to do the five senses game with me, and we just engage all five senses, specifically if we're outside, and slowing our pace down, and you begin to see things that you didn't see previously, right? Because our brains are so wired to categorize things. We don't need to keep labeling things, right? It's a really great thing, but it's also how we miss things. And we're invited all the time to witness what else is here. And I just think so much of that is slowing down and re-engaging what is already here, right? Our breath and our senses. So yeah, I just when you said that word yes, it sparked in me, I don't know, just this yes to everything is that is here. And I think that is kind of a lot of our work to recognize that we're always being invited into becoming who we are. It's just waiting for us, I think, to say yes. So I love that this is what you've labeled this. It's great.
Yeah. And you said, what else is here? I just think, we talk about the Enneagram or like, you fixate at one point, and that's most of the input that we're taking in is through that one lens.
Mm,
And just to ask what else is here is like, it, it almost can feel scary. There's like, there's so much here, which is why it can I don't know if you feel this as a 9, but I can feel so at the whim of all of the things that are here that it
mhm.
almost doesn't feel safe to ask what else is here.
Yeah. Yeah. I resonate with that. I think what comes up for me is there's an intentionality when I ask purposefully, when I go about wanting to see what else is here. Like there is a way that I am from my grounded self looking to experience something, to encounter it, versus where I'm merging with things and there's no one here to experience it. That's
Yes,
two different things in my mind, right?
definitely.
Yeah.
Like the groundedness is crucial. Like I know
Mhm.
I need an anchor, I need a tether, and then I can get really open.
Mhm.
But without that, it's like feels disorienting. It feels like yeah, do I even exist?
Yeah, yeah. I used to say, "The more of me I give away, the less of me there is." And it was just the safest way for me to keep dispersing myself so that I didn't have to be affected. But yeah, that groundedness, I think, is how we do it's the only way, I think, actually, for nines to truly experience something and be affected by it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what your journey was like kind of coming to your type actually. For me, I know learning that I was a body type was very confusing
Mm.
until I started to do the work and be like to recognize my relationship to being here sensorially, like being able to feel myself here and present has been life-changing. If that was the only thing that the Enneagram
Mm.
offered me, that would have been enough.
That's interesting. I've always had a sense, and I say that word a lot, and I catch myself. I don't mean always, but I actually do mean always when I say it right now. I've always had a sense of what I can do physically.
Hmm.
So I get what you're saying, but when I was first named body type, on some level, I actually understood it as, well, that kind of makes sense because I feel like I've instinctively known what my physical capacity is already. Like I could jump over that, and I can't jump over that. I mean, that sounds silly, but I remember growing up, like I used to rollerblade a lot with close friends, and my friend would always dare me to do stuff, and I would be like, nope, I can't. I know I can't do that one, but I definitely could do that. Yeah, it's it's a funny. example, I guess. But yeah, being a body type, I do, especially realizing that, recognizing that we are, the most out of touch with, and that's one of the ways that we are not able to be present. That's for me especially been helpful in my growing for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so funny the different experiences. I feel like my relationship was I probably can't do most things that are
Mm.
physical is kind of my go-to. And I also wonder, socialization wise as like a little
Mm.
boy, if that is more
Right.
encouraged to know your
Yeah.
physical capacity.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure you've shared this before, but I don't know how you kind of arrived at the Enneagram or when it called to you or when you first kind of took it on as something that you found to be crucial for your development. When sharing.
Yeah, so initially, I worked for a church for a couple years, and the the guys that started the church, they came from a place where they used the Enneagram in the culture there. So they initially started this environment with it as well. And it was more so as like simply a typology, a way to label and name things, which is, fine, just very limited. And I just remember I'd never gotten into any personality system before this. And this one, especially back then, the version of me that was showing up in the world was a bit turned off by the diagram. Also, like, you can't label me into one category. No, I was very turned off. Yeah. So, but that was probably, wow, that was 10 years ago. So I kind of didn't look at it for a while. And then it was maybe, I'm not great with time, but 6 or 7 years ago where I think somebody paid for me to attend a workshop. And I just remember it was a 2-day thing with Suzanne Stabile, and I remember sitting in the middle of the room, it just hitting me like a ton of bricks, like, I think I'm gonna do something with this the rest of my life. And what I've said before is I think why it shook me so much was, at least in that time, it felt like it was saying that I had only lived 1/9 of my potential. So it just sparked, what else am I capable of? How have I unknowingly drastically limited myself? What what's my capacity? What am I really capable of? I've always on in some level been motivated by growing, but this especially sparked a journey of like, what have I not tapped into yet that's within me? How can I go there? How can I get to that?
Do you have like a visceral sense, like when something's sparking you and something when you're motivated to grow through something, like what does that feel like for you?
It's definitely excitement. It's also what I think, they say, what fear and excitement show up in the same part of the brain. Fear is always a present thing when there's capacity I'm being invited into, because I don't know if I have what it takes to do that, to go there, to maintain that amount of energy and that amount of work. So it's definitely excitement. There's also grief involved because I've been asleep to things for quite a while. There's sadness, there's fear, there's anger, there's excitement. And sometimes there's been moments where if I don't like specifically tune into each one of those appropriately or give each one the right amount of time, all of that can just feel like, well, that's all too much. Maybe I'll get there at some point or I'll come back to this. But often, especially lately, like especially when I started having kids, they're huge external motivators, for a lot of reasons. But I don't know if you've heard that phrase, more is caught than taught. And I want my kids not just to hear things from me, but to also watch their dad live the hero's journey. And I want them to watch me do hard things. And in fact, it's one of our mantras in my home. It's in our in our home, we do hard things and we support each other in that. And so, my kids, they know that they could recite all the things to you. It's fun. And they think it's more annoying than anything. But yeah, they've witnessed their dad do hard things, and I'm not gonna stop doing that because, again, more is caught than taught, and at some point, in their little psyches and their subconscious, they're gonna be reminded that, "Oh, my dad was able to do this stuff. I could too."
Oof. Yeah. This image of you like wiring their little internal voices that
Mhm.
as they get older, they're going to have those phrases
Mhm.
deeply embedded. And to
Yeah.
choose them intentionally is already such, you know, deep work, I feel like.
That's the hope. Yes.
Well, something that got my attention and I deeply resonate as a nine as well, like this idea of if I start something, if I really open to something, am I going to be able to maintain it? Do I have the capacity?
Mm.
And it's almost, I don't know what it's like for you, but I feel the black and whiteness of yes or no. Like either I can do
Mhm.
this always or I can't do it and I shouldn't start.
Mhm.
And I'm at a point in my life where I'm talking about having kids, you know, starting that process. And I imagine as I'm feeling into that, like once they're there, it doesn't matter if you have the capacity every day or not. Like you are,
Mhm.
you're committed, right? And
Yeah.
there's also the reality is that it's not something that takes the same amount of energy every day,
Mm.
like because of natural ebbs and flows and natural rhythms and cycles. But my type doesn't get that. It's like I need to be reminded all the time that it's not yes or no. And I'm curious, like that idea that you have to maintain something, like what is that like for you?
Yeah. That's definitely been something I've been working on for quite a while. I would say m most of my life, I wasn't even aware of an option coming up for me to say yes to anything. Risking finding out if I have what it takes to have the amount of energy it would require to maintain anything, risking that, even finding it out, I'd rather not go there. I'd rather not find out if I do. More than likely, I don't. So a lot of my life, I didn't even have access to knowing if I could maintain. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like I'm having to go backward even farther. There, most of my life, there wasn't even enough of me here to know that I could even say yes to doing new things that would require maintaining energy, you know? Does that make sense? I think not another 9 is who's gonna understand that. That maintaining, there's so much when I would say 1 and 9 starts to kind of wake up and they start realizing they do have what it takes to show up to life, to embody themselves, to incarnate this human experience. There's another like you said, there's another fear of, "Well, how do I always stay on?" I remember when the pandemic hit and all of my roles, because I was in the same home doing all of my roles at the same time. My mother-in-law lived here. I just become a dad of a 3rd child. I was working from home. It was like all my roles all at the same time, and I didn't feel like I had any space for just me to be who I was without all the roles, and it just felt like I had to be on all the time. And that amount of pressure and that weight was just it felt like I couldn't maintain that. It was just too much all at once. And what I've been learning since that initial, when it first hit was first off, my initial fear, you know, it's been said that all our emotions are valid, our reactions to them might not be. And so like checking in, inquiring first about my fear of whether I can maintain something, being honest with myself. Well, hold on, I haven't even gone into it yet, so I shouldn't shut that possibility down right away.
What would it mean to not be on and still be technically in a
Oh,
role?
one thing I've been learning is you can't be on all the time. You don't have to be on all the time. This is why there's boundaries. This is why those were I don't know if they were created or if they were just discovered, but yeah, boundaries. What it means to be a human being is you are limited. Everybody is limited, and that's okay and that's normal, and we shouldn't refuse that part of ourselves. But I think in that initial, like, oh no, if I say yes to this, I have to always have all the energy required to do it all the time and always be on. I think that's like forgetting about the fact that no one's actually asking that of me. I am limited and I will have a way to show up to this in my own way, and that's what I need to honor. But one of the ways that I've learned to manage a lot is because I have had to do that, is through, what I would say is a balancing, some sort of, not balancing, but resiliency of learning resiliency from structure and rhythm. Those 2 things have been vital for me to balance, or at least I should say juggle or manage the amount of responsibility I have in my life. I'm 38 years old, and I've never, ever in my life had so much responsibility. I've got 4 kids, I'm married. There's so much more than that, but years ago, I don't know, a part of me would not have been able to manage the amount of responsibility I have now, and a lot of that is because now my life is more structured than it's ever been, and that is how I maintain different levels of energy and using different rhythms to maintain that, you know? So that's like, that is what gives me the courage to go into having the confidence of maintaining something, is if I can put it within a structure and I can rhythmically engage that, then I'll be okay because I've already built within this moments of slowing and moments of going for it.
Yeah. Oh, this is making so much sense. And also I see how I want to resist the any boundaries, any
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah. I
But
always was that way. I loved just chaos of life. Like, I flew by the seat of my pants. Any structure was like, nope, nope, not for me. No way.
yeah. And I'm remembering, I mean, it's a very different example than having many children and adult responsibilities. But in college, I remember joining a bunch of clubs and I started working at the cafe and like I was doing all these things and I felt like I had so much more capacity, like I was just
Mhm.
able to do it. But
Mhm.
thinking about adding things to my plate is so scary.
Mm.
And same with like working a traditional job has always been a challenge for me to think about, and I'm no longer doing that. But when I was and was working in nonprofits and there's so much going on all the time, I just the days where I had nothing to give, I was so tired and emotionally drained, like, were some of the best days I had at work
Mm.
because I finally let myself just be,
Mhm.
and fortunately, I was in
Mm.
spaces where I could name what was going on with me because I was working in mental health and people had language, and I was like, "Wow, I actually get to model this thing and let go of this unreasonable standard that I
Mm.
should somehow be, first of all, totally fine, and also performing in whatever way is necessary for the role that I'm in." And
Yeah.
those days where I didn't were like, those were the times where I could actually be like, ah, life is doable.
Yeah. Yeah, uh, to me, that's you letting yourself be human. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're just kinda, like, accepting what is truest of you. Yeah. Mhm.
And it's, I mean, going back to the practice of feeling your foot on the ground
Mhm.
and just this idea of acceptance. I mean, I think so much of
Mm.
the invitation of the Enneagram is like, can you actually view its reality as it is right now
Mm.
without needing to defensively or reactively make it different by either
Mm.
making yourself different or making the outside world different?
Yeah.
And then Carl Rogers was onto something where it's like, once you accept anything exactly as it is,
Mm.
then it can change
Mhm.
because there's
Yep.
no more resistance.
Yes. Definitely. I wish that sentence was said after it, because there's no more resistance. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Another thought I had about maintaining capacity, because I think that's what nines are afraid of. The first off, they're afraid of their capacity, their significance, and then the idea of what it would take, what it would require of me, the pressure, the amount of anything to maintain it, is how I've managed that, especially over the last few years, is also exploring my intensity. Because my intensity shows me what I'm capable of. Like, I have energy. Now it's just about having it appropriately for the right times. That's what I mean by rhythm, structure and rhythm. So, like, how intense can I get? How intense can I show myself I can go? And most people probably haven't seen this side of me, but I can be incredibly intense, as a body type. But, there's just so much anger in us that I don't know, like, especially at the gym, when I can just let myself, like, let's see what I've got, and I go for it, especially when I'm fueled by anger. Like I've said before, it feels like I could pick up a car and throw it across the room.
I just want to name, there's like a palpable intensity now I'm feeling at the last few minutes as we've
Mm.
started talking about all the things that are possible to do. It's like, I don't know if you're feeling it, but it's like, oh yeah, I'm here. I can do stuff.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there's also right behind that is a fear of my potential.
Yes. I I'm glad you mentioned the gym. Have been rock climbing and top roping and went yesterday. And one of the things my husband said to me a couple times yesterday, he was like, "Go until you give out."
Mm,
Like, and he's very good at gauging. Like, okay, if you're tired, I'm not going to push you too much. He's very attuned, which is helpful for me because I trust his words. Not just like, yeah, go.
mm,
But there's this way of, I mean, I'm secured, I'm in a harness. And so I can go for a hard move that I don't actually have the strength for and not make it and survive.
mm,
And that's
mm,
something my body needs to
mm.
know by practicing over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true just energetically with
Mm,
risk taking, or, they say like leap and the net appears. There's so much fear around that. But to be like, what if I actually tried it?
I really, for me, as a social 9 or a navigating 9, depending on who you're looking at teacher wise, a lot of the way I've self-sabotaged in the past has been around not allowing myself to have limitations or to make mistakes. So much of why I've withheld, like showing up with major contribution in the world and playing small, is because in my mind, everyone's watching and I have to not just hit a home run, but a grand slam every single time I'm up to bat. And I put that much pressure on myself to show up every single time. Like any experience with me, if I'm really showing up also in the area of the Enneagram, like you're gonna expect from me, like you're never gonna be the same because you experienced me. Well, that's just totally unrealistic, you know? And I don't know, it sets myself up for never showing up because I'm also expecting myself to have it all figured out before I'm willing to go.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much here. I think it's part of reaching toward the three space
Mm.
is all this pressure to perform and to be not just good enough, but
Mhm.
outstanding.
Yeah.
And also, like, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes people do have those experiences of me and it feels amazing.
Yeah.
And there is that part of me that wants that every single time and wants to be able to count on it. But the pressure of that destroys the capacity for it.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I used to work on crisis lines where we were talking to people who were potentially thinking about ending their lives.
Mm.
And the pressure of that is like, well, of course I have to hit a home run. Like this person's life hangs in the balance.
Wow,
And
yeah.
so much of what I learned from doing that and training people and taking so many calls is like, and I think it's the Enneagram work really working through me is like, I can't save anyone.
Mm.
And it's not really me. Like, yes, I can hone my skills and I can do my practices and I should.
Mm.
And then I have to trust that there's more than just me working on these bigger things.
Mm.
And it feels so delicate. But again, going into that level of intensity and living through it is like the only way that I had any semblance of letting myself off the hook for being that transformational catalyst that every single time.
Mhm.
And now my work is much less high stakes, although, spiritually people get to really dark places as well.
Mhm.
And the more I take the pressure off, the more I find people get to have their own experience.
Yeah, allowing ourselves to show up authentically with what we have today, and nothing less and nothing more. Yeah, that's okay. It's even more than okay. That's enough. Yeah.
Yeah, the anticipation is so much more painful than the experience.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. The potential pain of disappointment, of disappointing others, but also disappointing myself that I did finding out, "Oh, yeah, I didn't have what it takes to fully show up." That's what I meant by, like, risking finding out if I do or not. Like, that's so much of why I never even explored my capacity in the past because the disappointment of it not being true is I just rather not go there anyway? Yeah.
That's true. I take it back. I don't think the anticipation is as bad as, like, the crushing disappointment afterwards. And I have a lot of nines seek me out and work with me, and
Mhm.
it's so important for me because it's much easier to talk to myself through them.
Yeah.
But a lot of what we work on is finishing the story. It's not saying, "Well, and then I let somebody down, the end." And then I've failed as a human and I can't play the role that I thought I was here to play. And now I have no capacity and the like it feels so final in those moments where I've put myself out there or done something and it just doesn't feel like what I wanted it to feel like.
Mm,
And so much for me is like, how do I keep going? How do I recenter? How do I come back to the things that are okay in this moment to
mm,
recognize like my partner's not going to leave me. My clients and friends aren't going to turn their back on me.
mm.
Like life keeps going is actually hard for me to wrap my head around sometimes.
Yes. I feel like I resonate with that in that you're talking about, like, just the codependent sort of aspect of nine-ness? Because I did something that caused something for you, like, I can't access without you being okay, that I am okay, even if I hurt you or I
Mm.
disappointed you. If you're feeling uncomfortable or you're disappointed, how do I locate me still being okay despite that?
Yeah. And I know for me, it's so much projecting onto them that they didn't get what they should have
Mm,
gotten from me.
yeah.
Even if they're saying to me, "This was great. Thank you. You did
Mm,
an amazing job." There's this really deep part of me that says, like, there's some part of you that didn't get what you
mm,
needed. There's some part of you that hated my style of speaking or that
mm,
was upset by something I did or didn't do. And making up this whole story that is so upsetting to my entire being
mm.
it doesn't feel like it's located in me though, even though it is. And that I think is so much of the work is like, how do I turn toward that part in myself that has created these really cruel expectations for myself,
Mm.
like inhuman responsibility to always be the best, even the best version of myself.
Yeah. Yeah, back to you were talking about earlier, like, the black and white of it does feel like I have to have all the capacity or I have none.
The phrase for the social nine they say is like nobody special.
Mhm,
And I have been feeling more acutely as I keep going this desire to be special,
mhm.
and then the fear that that creates
Yeah.
in having become aware that I actually do want that.
Mm,
And then what if I'm now aware of it and I am not somehow?
mhm. Yep.
Which looking at anybody else, it's so easy to be like, of course, everybody has something so special, so unique to bring forth. And like, what if I don't? What if I'm just boring and I'm not going to contribute much and it doesn't
Mm.
matter anything I do?
Yeah. Yeah, I really resonate with that, and I forget where I heard it from, but I found it so helpful to realize that it's still weak ego strength to not just be huge in how much importance you give yourself, but also to be incredibly limiting of yourself. It's also egotistical. Both and if I minimize myself or I overdo it as well, both of those, either extremes I remember I used to think that just limiting myself the most in the room was meant that I was the most humble person in the room. And, it really obviously, it really isn't. It allowed for me to not be affected.
I went on a retreat last year, and the thing I came away with was like, if you don't share yourself, then you're withholding you from everybody else, and
Mm,
nobody gets it. Nobody gets the thing that you bring.
mhm,
And I keep thinking, with the word harmony comes up with it at point nine, and it's like, to have a harmony, you have to have multiple notes. And if
mm,
I just say, well, I'm not going to sing because I might sing the wrong note,
yeah.
we don't get the harmony. We don't get the full experience of the full inclusion of everyone's note, including mine.
And I don't think harmony always is peaceful either, you know? But I do think it is much safer to vicariously, try and embody myself through other people, through other things. I think that is still the easiest thing for me to do. I tend to do that in books. Like, it's easier for me to not contribute what I know or the value that I could bring into the world if I just keep reading another book, keep reading more. But I'm curious what your experience is of, like, trying to it's not safe to be embodied yourself, but if you can project your significance onto something else or someone else, that feels obviously feels safer, but yeah, like that light shadow, experience.
Mm, yeah. I'm trying to like feel into that question because I certainly outsource the location of where something important is happening, where
Mhm,
something interesting is happening. And I think there's this quality of like the higher quality of this thing is that between two people or within a group of people, something really new can emerge.
mhm,
But I'm trying to locate that thing that's emerging inside of someone else that's there
yeah,
and take myself out of it. It's like, well, yeah, the group does really good work, but if I come or don't come, it doesn't matter.
mhm,
Or like, well, Seth has all this great stuff to share on the podcast, and like he'll bring that instead of recognizing like
right,
I actually have to be here for this podcast in particular to exist. Like I
yeah.
have to. I'm bringing something,
Uh-huh,
and if I put it all on you, then we don't get the beautiful thing that happens when we get to play with it in between us.
definitely. I very much I hear what you're saying, I resonate with that as well. Like, there's a difference between just being a holding space, being, an environment in which somebody can still be themselves, but there's a part of how humans interact with one another that how we relate, like, I need another individual here, and if I'm only environmental, then there's nothing to, like, be in relationship with.
Yeah. I mean, it's been so helpful for me to start to recognize the different parts of myself and how I kind of can be in relationship with myself when I
Mhm,
start to
mm,
understand. Well, sure, there's like my essence, there's my ego, there's all these different, parts work is great. Like it it actually allows me to recognize a relationality that occurs within myself, which
mm,
is not my natural orientation, I don't think,
right,
before this work. But there is something that I've learned, I've recognized. First, I had an opposite pandemic experience where I
mm,
used to work, I used to kind of manage like over 100 people. They'd come in and out
mm,
through the week, and I had all these coworkers and all this stuff going on. And then I went to like living in a 1-bedroom apartment with my partner and our dog, and not we didn't have a pod or anything. We just like were alone.
mm, mm,
And well, fortunately, I had this work to help me, guide me, because I don't think it would have been pretty if I didn't. But being by myself so much more has helped me recognize or been able to discern more who are those people that I get to show up with. Because
mm,
it actually isn't satisfying to just be around anyone, because I have an experience that is my experience.
mhm,
And it's been kind of difficult to like take ownership over that, having to discern, oh, I don't just say yes to go see people because I like being around people. Like,
mm,
who are the people? What are the circumstances? How am I feeling today? Did I eat enough? Did I sleep enough? Do I
mm,
actually secretly have something else that I want to do and I think I can do all of it, but I'm actually sacrificing? Like, these are questions I never considered. It was just like, be around people or be alone. I'm going to be around people.
mm.
And that's kind of just I think from my childhood, like I was born into a family where there are a lot of people around
Yeah.
already. So that's felt normal to me.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I if I'm given the choice, I'll be by myself every time, for sure. Obviously, that's dependent on what you grew up with, like you said. And I was the oldest. I mean, I am the oldest, and the environment for me growing up was not a safe relational one. So I learned to self-regulate, on my own, because co-regulating was not a safe thing, So it is still it's something I've been working on really hard for a little bit now, is learning to co-regulate, be with other people. But that definitely, I mean, I hear you kind of talking about individuation. Like, I have to differentiate myself as a real life person too, in order to actually connect with you. I like to think of, your Enneagram type as probably first and foremost, it was used as a way to protect you growing up, but then it's also supposed to be a way of connecting you as well.
Mm.
And I think that's your Enneagram type, but it's also working with your ego, really, because there's this misconception that the ego is a bad thing, right? But yeah, it starts off as how you separate yourself from the world, but then it's also what you use to reconnect with the world too. But for nines, like, that's largely about individuating myself as a person with preferences and needs and opinions too. But I think there's so much about getting into solitude for nines, where we're not really able to individuate ourselves unless we're separate from people,
Mm.
or separate from the thing that we normally lose ourselves in.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when you're spending all this time alone, are you working on your preferences and your individuation?
It depends. Yes and no. It's both. Yeah, I've found also, I think I forget if it was in our earlier conversation before we hit record, if it was in this, that I used to say, the more of me I give away, the less of me there is. So when throughout a day, for example, that I kind of said yes externally when I meant no internally, when I dispersed myself, when I just forgotten myself over and over throughout a day, then when I'm separating myself, when I'm introverting heavily, that was because I just needed a friggin' break from people,
Yeah.
because I'd lost myself, And that wasn't individuating. I mean, it was more survival, you know,
Right.
not finding my preferences. It was just, I need legit peace right now to just not do anything, you know?
Yeah, but overstimulated and just well,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot over the past year or so, of like, what is rest? Like, rejuvenating, engaged rest.
Mm,
It depends on the quality of my presence.
mm,
And so trying to discern between what is I'm overstimulated and just need a break, and it could be just less input versus what is actually like rejuvenating and
Mhm.
restful. And I'm back with myself. And from there, I can choose an activity or I can play or I can explore. And I think most of my life, I didn't know how to do that engaged
Mm.
solitude.
Mhm. Yeah. That's interesting. I kind of hear from you that there's, at least in this conversation, potentially 2 forms of rest. One in which you're rejuvenating by potentially doing things, like cultivating resources, internal resources. That could be restful. Like, even just connecting with the right kind of people, people that are enlivening for me, but also the kind of rest in which I'm honest that I am out of resources and
Yeah.
I'm just gonna take a serious break. Yeah, those to me are 2 really important sides of rest. Yeah, it's not only just not doing anything. Sometimes it's also I'm having to rebuild my resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's very hard for me to actually not do anything. I
Mhm.
say I'm not doing anything because it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything of value,
Mm,
but to be not with a screen, to be not with a book, to really not do anything is certainly a cultivated practice for
mm,
me.
mhm,
So I'm curious, you know, in present day, you talked about some of the I mean, really, we talked about a lot of capacity building and taking risks to continue growing and continue cultivating both the inner life and the capacity to live in the external world as well with so much
mhm,
going on. What do you see as some of the current invitations for your growth right now?
mm. Yeah. One of them, and this was a little bit ago, but this is just what came up. When our 4th kid was going to be arriving, when we heard that announcement, when my wife, said, "Hey, look at this." That was a surprise to us, and I just remember in that moment that obviously started shaking things up in me, and I did think shortly after that, I remembered the theory of shocks from Gurdjieff and how, sometimes life brings what happens to us. There's a shock to the system in which or systems in which your life has been built on until that point. And I just remember thinking, how am I gonna exist without losing myself entirely when we add another kid to this mix? I'm like I said, the last time we had a kid, our 3rd one in the midst of COVID, it was so stressful and I lost myself in that for a period of time. So I knew that what I was being invited into was first that was an interruption to our lives. And one thing I've been trying to frame up as many things as I possibly can with is that interruptions are also invitations. So I love that you've called that this podcast invitations. But that interruption, I looked for that as a shock to find out, oh, within this shock there's going to be energy and potential that I am being invited into. So how can I leverage that? And so I just thought, okay, well, what this means is I'm going to have to cultivate 3.0 Seth in order to manage the amount of responsibility that I'm going to be trying to carry in 9 months or 10 months or whatever. And so this is kind of what I meant by like I've never had as much structure in my life as I do right now. Like what I started implementing was an early morning routine where I give myself 2 hours before everybody else wakes up because it's the only time that I have to start finding my preferences and start individuating myself. And that has been the most transformative practice of my life, my morning routine. Honestly, nothing in my life has been more life trajectory changing than this morning routine for me. And yeah, like what I was being invited into in that interruption was more capacity. And in a lot of ways, you could maybe even kind of say that is a lot of what nines are always being invited into. It's finding out what else they're capable of.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to share. One of my teachers is Marion Gilbert, and the way she teaches the shock points are that, the shock at point 3 is an involuntary one. It speaks to that interruption, like
Mm,
something happens
mhm,
and we don't choose it, that it's happening. It happens to feel like it's happening to us.
mm,
And the way that we work with it is to cultivate enough resources
mm.
to let ourselves fall apart, or the image of ourselves, our
Yeah.
ego
Wow.
ideal, gets rattled. And if we have enough resource, it actually becomes the convertible energy this shock does to
Mhm.
wake us up.
Yep.
And then the other piece of the teaching is like when we get to point 6, the other shock point, that one she talks about as being an intentional one. Like we have to choose it. We have to
Yeah. Mm,
willingly say yes to it. We have to accept it. And that at point 6 is this disillusion of what we believed. It seems very disorienting, but it's a choice on some level. And I just think that's fascinating. I
mm.
don't have wise words for it in this moment, but I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to label what I think. I am very grateful for somehow finding the capacity to do. I do think that's what happened for me. Yeah, because it sounds like a egotistical thing to say, but I did cultivate 3.0 Seth, and I am maintaining more responsibility in my life than I ever have. It did happen to me, and then I did have to choose it. Both of those things happened, and I'm still choosing it. And now I have the capacity to keep choosing it, you know? There is something in me that knows I can't go back. I don't wanna go back now, you know? Like,
Yeah.
wow, this is what I've been missing. That's kinda what it feels like. This is yeah, I just there's no reason to go back now because more of me is showing up now, and that is I'm more content because of that as well. It's interesting because there's more of me that's showing up, so there's more that's being done, but I also there's a contentment in yeah, it's hard to put into words. There's a contentment that I didn't even have before as well. So it's less about, like, the amount I'm doing and more about just the more whole you become, I think, the less you're trying to prove. There's that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's some sort of ego project that you have to give up.
Mhm.
We talk about saying yes to the transformation. You are saying no to something else.
Mm,
And I feel lately, I can feel myself trying to grasp for things that kind of sort of almost worked before. And I can tell that I can't do that anymore.
mm,
But there's still this fear of actually saying yes to letting myself get totally rocked
mm,
by whatever is happening. And it feels like this in between space of like the old strategy. I know it doesn't work.
mm.
And kind of fighting against the surrender into whatever is next that I can't understand with my ego mind.
Yeah, and I even think of then, like, another way to frame this up is with the 3 and the 6 is that you kinda have to let yourself realize you have value at point 3 and to accept that, and then have the courage to prove it, to make it true at point 6. And that's how then you know, on some level, like the holy love piece, I am I am a vital part of the whole. And sometimes some of this for me is about like how we actually practice into our being what is true for us. We have to go for it. We have to potentially recognize that maybe I do have value, and I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna have the courage to find out. And then that's in that practice of doing that over and over. Then we substantiate ourselves. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, what's coming up for me is this idea of just like this inherent lovability of all parts of me and all parts of reality is part of how I
Mm,
think about holy love.
Mhm.
or they talk about non-conceptual positivity. There's just like this lovability of all things which are conceivably made up of love, right?
Mhm.
And when we were talking before, I had some stuff come up or I was naming parts of me that I don't always want to accept.
Mhm.
And you're pointing out like, well, what if that part belongs too? What if it's all,
Right. Y
I mean, that stuff is non-dual. Like it, again, it's like hard to grasp conceptually because it's not really a concept that we can grasp. And in fact, we have to be absorbed into it instead of trying to absorb it into us.
mm. Yeah. To additionally answer that question about what I'm more recently, I guess what I'm being invited into is, I guess, just my emotional experience, more directly accessing the emotionality that's here. If that's the signpost of what my experience is, what is it trying to tell me? What's the information it's trying to communicate to me? And yeah, especially around the emotions that are not as comfortable for me, or that I some part of my story, I've associated that emotion with a negative one, even though it's just emotion and it is what it is. Yeah, like that Viktor Frankl quote that is between stimulus and response, there's a space. And when I think of space, I think of peace. But I think that the space is initially what I'm most not comfortable with. And that space is probably some level of disruption of my homeostasis that then turns more into fullness after I'm able to be with it, you know? So that's what I feel like I'm currently being invited into, to inquire more deeply into my experience by feeling more deeply the emotion that's here.
With the structure that you've built for yourself in this phase of life, how do you address the emotions that come up in different parts of your day or your life? Or does it look different how you hold it?
Sometimes it's just as simple as moving my attention to my heart space and just relaxing that area. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Maybe this will say a little bit about, just if I just tell a story. I had a seemingly minor operation done a couple months ago, and my indifferent instinct is definitely preserving, or the self-preservation. And I went into this very nonchalantly, like it's not that big of a deal. There were multiple days of recovery that I just didn't even look at. Like, I went and worked that night, that same night. I ended up having a seizure on the table, and I've never had a seizure in my life. And it was a big deal. I passed out, and the doctor was nervous. You could sense the room was different. Never seen somebody do that with this specific procedure that he's done so many of. And yeah, I just remember so quickly my programming kicked in immediately as I woke up, like, "Oh, it's all right, guys. Like, we're good. I'm fine." Oh, and like even going into that, in my mind, I was fine. I was so zen, but my body was not up for what was happening, and it shut down. It freaked out. And I just remember calling my wife after that. Like, I drove myself home. I probably shouldn't have. But I remember calling my wife, even minimizing my experience. And I knew that I had done that only later when my wife made a joke about something. And then after I did some processing, I was like, oh, you thought this wasn't a big deal because of how I communicated it to you. And I remember I was driving home, and it hit me like, hold up. Like, I passed out. This seems like I'm missing something. And I had a seizure. Like, that seems kind of severe. So as I was thinking about it, I thought, maybe I should feel something about this. And so I'd put the attention, into my heart space. And that's when sadness and fear came up that I did not have access to until I went there. And then I still don't quite know exactly what this was, but it wasn't until I got into my neighborhood. Maybe it was just like the safety of home that it hit even harder. Just like the frailty of life is what hit me for a day and a half. So I guess to answer your question, for me, sometimes it's just about simply checking in. I'm not normally accessing my emotions about an experience because we're so wired to not know how deeply we're experiencing something, to not be super affected, right? Our affect is very low. So I have to go looking for what is there purposefully. And so that has had to be I've had to put that as a practice into my structure.
Yeah. Ah,
Long way
thank
to
you.
get there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly relate. I have had a couple of near death
Mm,
experiences that I
wow.
immediately was like, ah, it's fine. I'm so
Yeah.
clumsy, or, well, whatever. And then later having to go back and be like, oh,
Mm,
I didn't know that I was going to survive.
mhm.
Really, just one, I got knocked off of like a cliff edge by someone who was climbing and like jumped down and knocked into me. Unfortunately, he jumped after me and
Whoa.
was able to grab me and grab a branch, and we climbed back up. And immediately it was like, I fell. Haha. Like this very protective. I mean, I feel it so often. This like goofy smile kind of comes up, and it's
Mm,
just like, this isn't the place where I'm supposed to feel things, so I'm not
right.
going to.
Yep. Even in
Um,
the threat of your life, your programming kicks in like, "No, oh, it's fine. I almost died, but it's fine." You know? That's
yeah.
insane. I get that, but that's crazy how intense and how protective it truly is.
Yeah, and this was in college, and I was with people who I didn't know super well, and I wanted
Mm,
them to like me and seem cool and whatever. And a closer friend was with me, and
mhm.
he repeatedly, he was like, "You almost died." Like, he
Yeah.
was, like,
Yep.
trying to, like, love on me and, like, be so grateful that I did it, like, had this big loving reaction that I
Mm,
it actually helped to hear it over and over, like, well, he thinks this is a big deal. That's
yeah.
good for me to know. And so later, me telling the story,
Mhm,
that was helpful, but like you said, it's almost like my mind had to allow it first, and then I mean, I don't remember if I went back specifically and processed this. It doesn't I mean, there's some stuff coming up as I'm naming it, but, like, just how protected that heart space is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I wanna respect your time, and I'm so, so grateful that you made space for this conversation. Yeah, I guess I like to name, especially sometimes for nines and many types, it's hard for us to name the higher qualities that we're also like transmitting and carrying around. And I'll just, I guess, say thank you because of I just don't even know how to explain it, but emotion came up before we started recording. And I just
Mm,
felt like you were holding space for me.
mm,
And this sense of like this interconnectedness and this
mm,
inclusivity and this invitation to help me feel like I'm part
mm.
of this united whole. I felt that coming through you, and I just name it as this as nice we can be that living invitation for others
Mm.
to start to embrace our interconnectedness and our wholeness that's inclusive of all the uncomfortable things.
Yeah. Man, just when you're saying that too, I wish we were recording that too, because what has come up for me, I mentioned earlier, like I see type as being a way that we initially protect ourselves coming into the world, but also hopefully ended up being used as a means of connecting. And that's what I think we ended up doing. Like when something came up for you, it felt vulnerable, and I think that's actually the like the thing that starts the possibility for connection. is vulnerability. Like you even named that I feel like maybe I shouldn't, be closing my eyes. And that it started as protection. But then as we named it, like it is then how we actually, I feel like, connected.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I think especially as I think this is the first time we've communicated directly with our
Hmm.
voices.
Yes.
And yet part of it was having experienced some of your energy through, hearing your voice elsewhere and our exchanges.
Hmm.
And part of it was really knowing and feeling your nine energy
Mm,
to recognize in myself that it was safe, that it
mm,
would be welcomed, that it would be
yeah.
included. And I don't necessarily feel that with all nines, but certainly
Mm,
nines who are engaged in here.
mm,
That's the quality. It's like this, there's nothing that I could do that could ruin this, that could kick me out of connection.
and I know we're trying to wrap up here, but that also brings up for me the difference between just being an environment in which someone can be in, and I would say maybe the difference between you feeling safe with certain nines and maybe not as much being able to be vulnerable with other nines is the capacity to a person here to receive you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and we're like just play by playing it, but you also named as I was saying, "Oh, I'm trying to be here with you while I'm feeling," and you were saying, "Oh, I'm also feeling the discomfort of
Mm,
you. I don't know if you want to be seen right now."
mhm,
But because you named that and brought in your own experience, it was like now two people are here receiving and
mhm.
transmitting, right?
Yeah.
And that is much safer than just four walls holding me, right? There's
Yeah.
something else there.
Yes.
Interestingly, I actually find it
Mm,
more difficult to cry and fully feel when I'm totally alone.
mm.
Having a safe other open something.
Yeah, it's almost like the emotion goes out to nowhere or it's held, and
Yeesh.
you can't something can't be held without a holder,
Mm.
you know? So, yeah, I just think potentially what was happening is 2 healthy people holding their kindness well.
Beautiful.
We're
I
doing it. We're
We're
doing good
doing
stuff
it.
together.
It's so good because part of me, and maybe this is for autonomy or something, like I would like to learn to let like the earth hold me more or let
Mm,
like the cosmos hold me more. But part of that is I don't want to always need another person. I don't
mhm,
want to be a burden. I don't want to take up time when someone could be doing something much more important. But for you naming that, like, of course, I believe a holder helps so much. That's why I do the work I do.
mm, yeah,
That's why I believe in the power of holding space for another person
yep,
as a person.
yep. Oh,
Ugh,
man, I have so many thoughts, but we should wrap up. Oh, that's really good. It's been a serious pleasure being with you. I haven't had many podcast interviews where the conversation was so not planned like this one, but this one felt more authentic than most I've had.
yeesh. I appreciate you saying that. I can feel little parts of me starting to be like, did we get to the
Mhm,
things or whatever? And also, yeah, I'm really, as I'm finding my intentions on going with this project, it really is just to have authentic
mm,
conversations with folks who have the awareness and have some experience to be in it with me.
mhm,
So thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Well, I'll just finish and say, because you asked if there was anything I wanted to wrap up with, and just as an encouragement to people listening, that your obstacle can also be your opening. So, when there is an interruption, when there is something that feels like you're not in control, like we've said, because it can be an interruption, but it's also, like you said, like this is called an invitation for seeing more clearly.
Yeah. Thank you for that wisdom and for being you. I'm so appreciated it. If you want more of Seth, or that you have your own podcast where you also dig really deep.
Yeah, yeah, and we just launched today.
Congrats.
Today. Oh, wow, today. Season 4. So our introduction episode for season 4 started. It's called Fathoms, and I do it with 3 other really amazing people. So, yeah, Fathoms, and you can find me on it's been a minute since I've posted over there because a lot of life has been happening, but I also have integrated Enneagram on the Insta.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Seth.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, so you can see how Seth is an incredible example of a 9 doing his work, and I'm so grateful for such an engaged conversation. And as you might have clocked, we recorded this a while back, so I'm really just so happy to have it out in the world because learning from Seth is something that is super valuable. And fun fact, at the IEA conference where I met Seth in person, like I mentioned in the beginning, I had a somatic process with Marion Gilbert, and what came up was that near-death experience that I was describing in this episode. And I got to somatically work through some of the ways my body actually was fighting to say yes to life and not die. And it was just a really powerful experience. So it was sweet listening back to this and remembering that. So, to my friends listening in, I keep saying real time, I just mean the time this is coming out in March 2025. There will not be a new episode next week. I am actually going to be helping to facilitate Marion's modules 1, 2, and 3 in person next week in California, so I know that will be very juicy. But I will be back in 2 weeks with my type 1 interview. And in the meantime, I put some reflection questions on the post that has this podcast episode on Substack. So head over there to share your reflections in the comments, and we can keep responding to these invitations together. I would love to hear what's landing in you from this. And doors are open now to apply to the Enneagram Heart Work cohort, which is a somatic-oriented group that I'm facilitating starting April 9th, 2025. So again, if you are in 2025 listening to this in the spring and you want to come together for real live engaged presence online, doing panel work and getting to the heart of what is keeping us from feeling and processing our own grief, head to karenburley.com/cohort to see all the details. Okay, until next time. Thanks for listening to Enneagram Invitations. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share with a friend. And if you haven't yet, subscribe on Substack to get new episodes and show notes straight to your inbox. And you can join the conversation in the comments over there. That's karenburley.substack.com/podcast. Want to go even deeper? Paid subscribers are invited to intimate discussion spaces facilitated by me, where we keep exploring these invitations together. If you're in the process of saying yes to your own transformation, I'd love to see you there.